In this episode, we move into one of the most practical and most misunderstood parts of risk management because a great deal of confusion, delay, and repeated failure comes from one simple problem. People know a risk exists, but nobody is truly clear about who owns the decision and who owns the controls connected to that decision. For a brand new learner, risk ownership and control ownership can sound like formal management language that lives only in policy documents. But the reality is much more immediate. When ownership is unclear, risks stay open too long, treatments stall, reports become vague, and teams begin assuming that someone else is handling the matter. That is why the Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (CRISC) mindset places so much value on assigning ownership clearly. A mature organization does not just identify risks and write them into a register. It makes sure the right person is accountable for deciding how the business will respond, and it makes sure the right person or group is responsible for operating the safeguards that support that response over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our Course Companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is with the difference between risk ownership and control ownership, because beginners often assume they are the same thing when in practice they serve different purposes. A risk owner is the person with the authority to decide how the organization will handle a particular exposure and whether the remaining level of risk is acceptable in light of business objectives, obligations, and tolerance. A control owner is the person responsible for making sure a specific safeguard, review, process, or mechanism is designed, implemented, operated, and maintained as intended. Those two roles often work closely together, but they are not interchangeable. The risk owner decides what the business is willing to do about the exposure, while the control owner helps carry out the control activities that reduce or monitor that exposure. This distinction matters because many weak programs confuse operational effort with decision authority. A team may perform daily reviews, patch systems, test backups, or manage vendor oversight, yet still not have the authority to say whether the business is prepared to accept the remaining exposure if those measures prove incomplete or ineffective. That difference becomes easier to hear when you think about the business nature of risk decisions. Risk belongs to the business because business objectives, customer commitments, legal obligations, and financial consequences are ultimately what make the risk meaningful. A technical team may understand the weakness with great precision, but if the exposure affects revenue, service continuity, compliance posture, or customer trust, the decision about how much of that exposure the organization can live with belongs at the level where those business consequences are actually owned. This is why risk owners are often business leaders, service owners, process owners, or executives rather than the analysts or engineers who identified the issue. The point is not to minimize technical expertise. The point is to make sure the person deciding whether the business accepts, mitigates, transfers, or avoids a risk is someone with the authority to make that choice responsibly. When organizations miss this point, technical teams often get left carrying decision pressure they were never empowered to resolve, while business leaders remain too distant from the exposure to recognize what they are implicitly asking others to tolerate. Control ownership, by contrast, is much more focused on the operation and quality of the safeguard itself. A control owner may be responsible for ensuring that access reviews happen on time, that change approvals are performed consistently, that logs are examined according to policy, that backup testing is completed, or that vendor due diligence steps are carried out before a new relationship begins. In some cases, the control owner is a manager. In other cases, it may be a team lead, a process owner, or a specialist function that has been given clear responsibility for a recurring activity. What matters most is that the organization can identify who is accountable for the control's design, operation, maintenance, and evidence of performance. A control that belongs to everyone usually belongs to no one. That is why mature organizations make control ownership visible rather than assuming that a policy statement or a shared expectation will somehow ensure consistent execution over time. Controls reduce risk only when real people or clearly defined teams know that part of their job is to make those safeguards work in practice. One of the clearest reasons this topic matters is that poor ownership creates silent gaps. A risk may be identified in an assessment, entered into a register, discussed in a steering meeting, and even appear in quarterly reporting, yet still remain effectively unmanaged if the risk owner is not clear or if the named owner does not actually understand that the role belongs to them. The same thing happens with controls. A change review process may exist on paper, and several people may assume it is happening. But if no one is clearly accountable for making sure the review is performed thoroughly and on schedule, the control becomes fragile very quickly. This is one reason repeated issues often appear in organizations that otherwise seem busy and well-intentioned. The problem is not always a lack of effort. It is often a lack of accountable assignment. When nobody feels the weight of the decision or the operation personally enough to drive it forward, the organization drifts into a dangerous middle ground where risk appears to be managed because activity is happening, while in reality ownership is too diffuse to produce reliable results. A practical way to understand risk ownership is to think of it as decision accountability rather than task ownership. The risk owner may not carry out every technical change, write every procedure, or review every control record, but that person is accountable for making sure the organization has decided how the exposure will be handled and whether the remaining position is acceptable. This includes understanding the business impact, listening to the analysis provided by specialists, weighing treatment options, approving a path forward, and revisiting that decision if conditions change. A risk owner therefore needs authority, context, and enough business understanding to make a judgment that affects real operations. This is why assigning risk ownership to the security team by default is often a mistake. Security may advise, analyze, and recommend, but the business area that depends on the process, revenue stream, regulated data, or customer relationship is often the place where true ownership belongs. C-risk thinking keeps returning to this principle because organizations manage risk more responsibly when the people who own the consequences also own the decision about how that exposure will be handled. Control ownership works differently because it is more closely tied to day-to-day operation and evidence. A control owner should know what the control is meant to do, how often it must be performed, what inputs and approvals are required, what evidence demonstrates it happened, and what should happen when the control fails, is skipped, or reveals an issue needing escalation. This means control ownership often sits closer to operational work than risk ownership does. A business leader may own the risk of unauthorized transactions in a process, but a specific manager may own the control that reviews privileged access, and another may own the control that validates exception approvals. That division is not a weakness when it is designed clearly. In fact, it often makes the environment stronger because it reflects the practical reality that reducing a business risk usually depends on several different safeguards and several different operational accountabilities. The important point is that each control must have a visible owner, and those owners must understand that the responsibility is not symbolic. It includes ongoing performance, evidence, and correction when the control stops doing what leadership assumes it is doing. This topic also becomes much clearer when you recognize that one risk can have multiple control owners, and one control owner can support multiple risks at the same time. A critical customer platform may face risks related to availability, data exposure, fraud, and third-party dependency, while the controls supporting that platform may include access management, logging, vendor review, backup validation, change approval, and resilience testing. Each of those controls may be owned by a different team or manager, yet the overall risk still needs a clearly identified owner who can decide whether the combined control environment has reduced the exposure enough for the business to proceed responsibly. This is why organizations should resist the temptation to oversimplify ownership by pretending one person can or should control every moving part. The better approach is clarity without false simplicity. Identify the risk owner at the level where the business consequence is truly held, and identify the control owners at the points where specific safeguards live. Once those roles are visible, coordination becomes much easier because people can see where decision authority stops, where operational accountability begins, and where the two must remain aligned. Assigning ownership well depends heavily on choosing the right level in the organization. If ownership is assigned too low, The person named may understand the issue but lack the authority to fund the response, accept the residual exposure, or force collaboration across departments. If ownership is assigned too high, the person named may have formal authority but be so far removed from the process that the role becomes symbolic rather than active. The strongest assignment usually sits where business consequence, practical understanding, and real authority overlap. That might be a service owner, a business unit leader, a process manager, or an executive sponsor depending on the size and structure of the organization. The same principle applies to controls. A control owner should sit close enough to the work to understand whether the safeguard is operating effectively, but not so low that the role has no practical influence over execution, staffing, evidence, or escalation. Good ownership assignment, therefore, is not about titles alone. It is about matching accountability to where the organization can actually make and enforce responsible decisions. Another important lesson is that ownership must be explicit rather than assumed. Many organizations believe they have assigned ownership because everyone informally knows which team usually deals with a certain issue. That kind of informal awareness may work for a while, especially in smaller environments, but it becomes fragile as systems grow, staff changes, vendors multiply, and incidents create pressure. A mature risk program makes ownership visible in records, governance materials, control descriptions, process documents, and risk register entries, so there is little doubt about who is expected to decide, who is expected to operate, and who is expected to report or escalate when problems appear. This matters because risk management depends on traceability. If a control fails, leadership should be able to tell who owns it. If a risk treatment stalls, leadership should be able to tell who owns the decision about how to proceed. Explicit ownership does not guarantee perfect execution, but it creates a much stronger basis for follow-up, improvement, and accountability than informal custom ever can. Documentation plays a central role here because ownership that lives only in conversation is easy to forget, misremember, or reinterpret later. A risk register should show the risk owner clearly, and control inventories or process records should show who owns each key control or control family. Response plans, exceptions, governance approvals, and review records should also reinforce ownership so that the organization has a consistent record across time and across functions. This is especially important during audits, incidents, leadership changes, and major transformations, because those are the moments when people discover whether ownership was truly assigned or only casually assumed. Good documentation also helps educate the organization. When managers see their names attached to specific risks or controls, they are more likely to recognize that risk management is part of how the business is run rather than something the security or compliance team handles somewhere off to the side. That cultural effect is powerful. Visible ownership helps move risk management from abstract policy language into the normal structure of accountable business leadership. There are several common mistakes that weaken ownership even in organizations that are trying to do the right thing. One mistake is assigning the risk to the security team simply because the issue has a technical component, even though the real business consequence belongs elsewhere. Another is assigning control ownership to a generic team rather than to a named role or accountable manager, which makes follow-up much harder when the control weakens or fails. Some organizations also confuse participation with ownership. A person may support a project, review a finding, or help gather evidence without actually owning the risk or the control. Another common problem is failing to revisit ownership as the business changes. A risk that once belonged to one service area may need a new owner after a merger, platform migration, outsource process, or change in customer dependency. The same is true for controls. Ownership that made sense during initial design may no longer fit after reorganization or automation changes. Strong programs review ownership periodically rather than assuming the original assignment will remain correct forever. For exam thinking, one of the best habits is to ask who has the authority to decide about the exposure and who has the responsibility to operate the safeguard. That simple distinction often helps separate plausible but incorrect answers from the stronger response. If a question involves whether a risk should be accepted, funded, escalated, or reevaluated, the correct answer usually points toward the business or process owner at the level where consequences are truly held. If a question involves whether a review, approval, backup test, or monitoring process is being performed properly, the answer is more likely to focus on the owner of that control or operational process. The exam may describe people from technical, business, audit, legal, or governance functions in ways that make more than one option sound reasonable. The key is to stay anchored to the role each person actually plays. Ownership in C-Risk is about accountable authority, not simply about who knows the most technical detail or who touched the issue first. By the end of this discussion, the main lesson should be clear that assigning risk and control ownership is one of the foundations of mature risk management because it gives the organization a clear answer to two essential questions: who decides how the business will handle a given exposure, and who makes sure the safeguards supporting that decision are actually working over time. Risk ownership sits with the person or role that has the authority to make business decisions about residual exposure. Control ownership sits with the person or role accountable for operating and maintaining the safeguard in practice. These roles are related, but they are not the same, and confusion between them creates delay, repeated weakness, and silent gaps in accountability. When ownership is assigned clearly, documented visibly, and reviewed as the business changes, risk management becomes much more disciplined and much more effective. That is why this topic matters so much in Domain 3. It turns responsibility from something assumed into something explicit, and that is one of the clearest signs that an organization is serious about managing risk rather than merely talking about it.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.